Oh, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to meet you all. You'd think after 9 years as a DGS and nearly 40 years of teaching, I'd remember the names of the people I'm talking to, but it's going to take me a while to do that here. I'm impressed and slightly scared of the amount of expertise facing me, both in terms of archaeological expertise and in terms of scientific expertise. So I hope I can do justice to your different interests. I should begin by saying thanks to Carrie and to other senior people at CISINC for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here, and we're hoping very much that our project, that is, and CISINC will be able to cooperate and collaborate in the future in more ways than simply having invited lectures in one direction or the other. I should begin by saying, hopefully you'll be pleased to know I'm not going to talk about medieval hagiography. Very briefly, I may mention St. Theodore, but he's really just a sort of means to an end. What I'm particularly interested in today is, if I'm not misusing the word, synthesizing different sorts of data, archaeological, historical, paleoclimatic, paleoenvironmental, to try and draw a relatively holistic picture of a particular set of historical developments that took place in the 6th and 7th and 8th centuries CE, or AD if you prefer. And this is part of, or one case study among many, that are part of our project on climate change and history at Princeton, which has now been running for 4 years, and which we hope will carry on for another 2 or 3 years at least. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to do 3 things really. One is to create a common environment in which scientists and social scientists can talk to each other, and in which the vocabulary we use actually mean the same thing to each other. We often found that in our initial meetings, people working in terms of millennia and people working in terms of decades or years or even weeks, historians, use the same words to mean completely different things. And we had to overcome that problem. And then the second thing is putting that into a context. We're interested in consilience between all these different disciplines and subdisciplines, and finding a way of utilizing one another's data and research methods and analytical methods towards solving common problems. And then the third thing we're interested in is the question of causation. Causation between human society on the one hand and the environment on the other. More importantly, between natural phenomena, let's call them even exogenous phenomena, such as volcanoes, earthquakes, droughts, and so forth, which are not part of a regular pattern to which human beings are accustomed or to which societies become accustomed, and the impact that they have on society and how we can demonstrate the way in which that impact actually works. And that enables me to segue into my first, slide. As I said, climate, environment and society are linked in causally complex ways. The problem for historians and archaeologists is to locate the mechanics. And as I said, also we need to take into account scale, and we also need to take into account the cultural logic or belief system, or whatever you want to call it, of the society we're dealing with. A society might appear, from our point of view, to be perfectly well equipped to deal with issues of environmental stress. But if the society itself isn't mentally equipped to deal with those stresses, in other words, if it doesn't have the same sort of functional response that we imagine it should have, then it won't respond in the way that we expect. And we have to be very careful not to impose our logic on past societies, even quite recent past societies. And even more important for contemporary concerns, imposing our logic on other societies of our own time, but from very different parts of the cultural world. And this is an issue which comes up a lot when one looks at the way in which scientists in particular, although they're not to blame all by themselves, use historical data, and the way in which historians use or abuse scientific data. And one of our project aims is to try and overcome or bridge these problems. Now, it's not hard. This is a good example of a very good article written a couple of years ago, in which dendro data from northern China and from the Altai Mountains and from the Alps was used to demonstrate that in the period from the 530s to the middle of the 7th century, there was an unusual dip in temperature on a global basis. And what the scholars who studied this did was to, you can't see the details, so you'll have to take my word for it, was to compare the graph of the dendro data produced from these different tree rings in the Alps and the Altai with a range of historical events across Eurasia. And lo and behold, they found a number of synchronisms or parallels where particularly cold winters were paralleled by particular political developments, such as droughts or the movement of populations, nomadic populations, for example, and so forth. And they then read into that a range of political implications for what was going on in that period. Now, in principle, there's nothing wrong with that, and indeed, it's been done a great deal, particularly for the ancient world, for example. The so-called Bronze Age collapse is a classic example. The collapse of the classic Maya, for example, in Central America, and one or two other cases. And while on the face of it, there's nothing wrong with saying, well, climate and environmental impacts on human societies in various ways, demonstrating the relationship is the problem. And unfortunately, it's often the case that historians and scientists make the assumption that there's a causal connection when in fact it should be demonstrated, because we can show from other case studies, and I'm going to give you one in the course of today's talk, where climate looks as though it could be important, but when you dig down, it turns out that it's not climate, it's a combination of factors in which climate is only one important element. One of the things that we discovered in our project was that making global generalizations doesn't get us very far, precisely because we don't dig down deep enough. So the first thing we decided to do was to run a series of case studies in which we would try to take all the different elements into account and see if we could locate any actual connections in terms of cause and effect between the different elements in question, and build, as I said earlier, a holistic picture. And I'm going to give you an example from some of the work that I've been doing, in the field in Turkey, which relates to this particular period I mentioned, the history of the Byzantine or medieval East Roman Empire in the 7th and 8th centuries. So we're focusing on Anatolia, mostly modern Turkey. And one of the things that we know about, and I'm not going to give you Byzantine history 101 here, but one of the things that we know about is that during the 6th century, the Roman Empire re-expands to recover a lot of territory it lost in North Africa and Central Europe, particularly Central Mediterranean regions like Italy. And then in the course of the middle of the 7th century, because of the Arab-Islamic conquests, Muhammad dies in 632, the conquests take off, and in 8 or 9 years the East Roman Empire loses most of its territory. It loses 2/3 of its territory and about 3/4 of its revenues in a period of 12 years. And it does survive, and it goes on to recover to become one of the most important Mediterranean powers for a brief period in the 11th century. So one might ask, how come any state, any organized and relatively sophisticated state such as the Eastern Roman Empire could survive such a catastrophic loss? Imagine if any modern state lost 2/3 of its territory, and certainly if it lost 3/4 of its revenues, its tax revenue, what would happen? And yet the empire, and that's the book that Carrie mentioned, which I produced in 2016, the empire didn't actually die. Although, as my chair pointed out when he read the book, he said, yes, it did, only 700 years later. So, okay, you can look at it in the long term, but at this point, when it should have died, it didn't. And so this is the empire in the 6th century, at the height of the so-called Justinianic reconquests. So this is the core part of the empire here, up to the Danube, into the Syrian desert, Egypt, and then these hatched areas are the bits that are recovered in a series of reconquest wars from the 530s to the 550s. After the Arab-Islamic conquests, however, this is what's left. So it's a massive reduction. What's even more important is that all these wealthy provinces here, these are the richest provinces of the empire, Egypt, Syria, parts of modern Jordan, and North Africa. They're all lost. So they actually generated a huge amount of revenue for the Roman state. And it's left with one rich area, which is Sicily, very rich in cereal production, and then relatively poor areas, including most of what's now Turkey. In modern Turkey, you look at any statistical yearbook, even now, a lot of its land is no use for, even with modern agrarian technologies, is no use for agriculture. But it's much better exploited now, of course, post-Second World War and post-agrarian technological revolution in the 60s and 70s in this area than it would have been in medieval times. And then surprisingly, by the early 11th century, the empire's re-expanded. It's recovered huge swaths of North Syria and northern Iraq. It controls the Crimea, the Black Sea. Its border is along the Danube again. It controls all of the Balkans. It hasn't expanded back to recover the West, but in the context, given that there are now a series of major Central European powers, the German Empire, for example, to deal with, it's a remarkable story. So the question is, how did this happen? And I sort of set out 5 key themes that needed to be examined in order to locate the causes. I'm only going to focus on the last one today, although I'll mention some of the others in the process of discussion. So these are the 5 key themes I looked at. By the way, if anyone has any questions about any sort of factual details, please just put your hand up and I'll stop and try and clarify. So the first context in terms of environmental factors, and the question was, did the environment, or could the climate have had any impact on the empire's decline or survival? And so I looked at the general climatic context first of all, and the story can be told at great length, but very, very briefly. There is a period which some of you will know about called the Roman climate optimum, or the Roman warm period, which lasts roughly 4 centuries, 3.5 centuries maybe. And it's chased from the middle of the 2nd century by a period of much less stable climatic conditions, a much more varied climate regime. And this has been linked with a whole range of issues that affected the structure, stability, and politics of the Roman Empire. Some scholars argued originally that climate change brought the fall of the Roman Empire. That simply doesn't work. It's much more complicated than that. We have to build into it the history of disease and epidemic. We have to build into it the history of changing societal relationships, particularly relationships between state and elite on the one hand, and between elite and peasantries and producing populations on the other, as well as the whole business of barbarian invasions and so forth. I'm not going to talk about any of that. The point is that when we look at when we home in our micro region or our sub-region, which is Anatolia, we find an interesting situation. First of all, it's a very, very fragmented climate regime, very complex. There's a high degree of regional and sub-regional variation, and you can see that firstly in the fact that it's affected by these 3 different climate systems. The tail end of the monsoon, the North Atlantic system, and the Siberian system, and you can see it even more clearly in the pattern of seasonal rainfall, a very broken up, very variegated precipitation landscape, and you can see it also perhaps a little bit more obviously, and again I'm flipping through these quite quickly, in terms of fall, winter, spring, and summer temperatures. And we know quite a lot about the climate of parts of Anatolia from carbonate mineralogy and a range of other proxies. Again, I'm not going to go into details here, but this is primarily based on material from 2 lakes in Cappadocia in south-central or southwest central Asia Minor, which show that from 580 to 730 in this part of Asia Minor, and indeed we've got other proxies that support the evidence for the rest of the Anatolian Peninsula, it gets generally wetter within that time period. And this contrasts fairly dramatically with what's happening in the Levant, where it gets drier and more arid. And we can now suggest, we've got fairly good reason for suggesting, that's partly to do with the shift of the Indian monsoon slightly northwards. One of the other things, though, that we find is that traceable shifts in agricultural outputs in terms of cereal production, plants and crops associated with livestock farming and so forth, do not coincide with any particular change in climate. In other words, we have a shift towards wetter conditions in the later 6th or early 7th century up until the middle of the 8th century. Then there's a shift towards drier conditions in Anatolia, and then it gets more humid again in the 10th century. And if I've got time, I'll come back to some of the implications of that later transformation towards the end of the talk. But there are two major developments which can't be explained through any climatic change. One is a dramatic fall in agrarian outputs as reflected in pollen densities and distributions, and two is a changing patterns of production. I just want to illustrate this again. The resolution from where you're sitting is not very good, but you'll see that on these charts there's a high which is usually in the 6th century, followed by a dramatic collapse, which sometimes not quite so dramatic, which takes place during the 7th century. And this reflects a range of things that we do know a little bit about in terms of demographics, for example, the impact of bubonic plague, also the Arab Islamic invasions on Asia Minor, which devastated some areas. I can talk about that in a bit more detail in a moment. And this seems to reflect a relatively dramatic decline in population and settlement, and it's mirrored in the archaeological pattern for settlement, with the retrenchment of rural settlement towards urban centres, a fortification and focus of urban centres on their defensible cores, and a retreat from open suburbs to more defended foci. Not a universal pattern, it's sub-regionally varied as well, so we need to take that into account. And some areas are affected more than others, and those areas that are affected most are reflected also, the effects are corroborated in the written sources, both in Arabic, Armenian, and Greek and Syriac, which give us some idea of the geography of raids and invasions. But Asia Minor was never actually occupied by the Arabs, it always remained Byzantine land. But here we see a change in production of cereals, a reduction in total grazing potential, and in tree crops. And this is mirrored very clearly at certain sites. I've just put a tabulation of some of these changes up here by region, southwest, west, northwest, and north, centre, and centre, to give you an indication. We have a few other sites, but the general picture is corroborated by all these different sites. But what's interesting, firstly, is that, as I said, these changes don't coincide with any climate shift. That's important. The second thing is that they don't all happen at the same time, and sometimes they don't happen at all. And what's even more important is that some of the changes happen in sites quite close to places where no change happens. Too close for it to be affected by any natural event. So we have to assume that these changes are, in some way, anthropogenic. So the question is, in what way? How are they anthropogenic? So as I say, you get this simplified agro-pastoral regime, as well as the reduced level of activity I mentioned. This doesn't coincide with climate. In one or two places, it may coincide with a shift in temperature. The cultivation of olives, which was a big industry on the southern Black Sea coast around Sinope, if any of you are familiar with the geography of Turkey, around Sinope, which is the sort of center of the Turkish Black Sea coast. We find archaeological evidence for a sort of collapse of the olive industry. This may be partly market-led. It may also be partly to do with a reduction in average seasonal temperatures, and that it would affect olive cultivation, as we know, very dramatically, very quickly. But we need to find or think about finding other possible causes for this change. So what are the reasons why farmers might change what they produce? Obviously, environmental stress is one possibility. Shifting market demand. We can track that in earlier periods when we have much better ceramics in the Roman world, showing how patterns of production and patterns of market exchange shifted quite considerably according to other circumstances that we know about, whether political or other. We can track that in terms of ceramic volume and densities, types of ceramics, where they were produced, where they were exported to, and so forth. But we don't really have a lot of evidence for a major shifting market demand at this period, although it has to be said as a caveat that our understanding of the ceramics of this, what used to be called Dark Age period, this period from the middle of the 7th or later 7th century into the early 9th century, are still pretty basic. We still need a lot more work. And then another set of possibilities which would have made peasants, farmers, agriculturists change what they produced would be pressure from a third party. And there are many options. It could be your landlord, it could be the government, depending on the societal structure that we're talking about. It could be an enemy, it could be warfare, for example. We've already discounted environmental pressure, but I suppose you could incorporate that into that. But I'm trying to separate these out a little bit. But as we've said, we can more or less discount environmental pressure as far as we can tell. Market changes, market exchange, market conditions could explain some of the changes, but unlikely on such a general scale across the whole of Anatolia with such a diverse and variegated pattern of change. So third-party pressure seems to be the obvious solution. And this is where we get a very interesting coincidence between paleoenvironmental data and historical archaeological data. There's a lake in Cappadocia called Nargolu, Lake Nar. It's annually laminated, and it has records which go back on C14 dating to about 300 CE. And it means that we can actually read off on an annual basis, which is really unusual, what was being produced in the area of Lake Nar. From about 300, when the record begins, to about 670, the Pollens show the pretty standard Mediterranean, sub-Mediterranean agrarian landscape with a range of crops and products. And then between 664 and 678, virtually all the evidence of anthropogenic activity ceases. This is Lake Nar. It's a crater lake. If you can read the details there, you can see where it's located in Turkey, and then there's a picture. And I probably should confess that when we were coring the lake about here, I actually fell in, much to the annoyance of my geologists and geographers who told me I was going to disturb all the sediments. It turned out that it's actually very, very well stratified, so even with me thrashing around wildly trying to get back on the platform, we did no damage. However, I did make a fool of myself, although as my wife says, that's not unusual. So we have 2 or 3 lakes like this, but this is the best sedimented, this is the best varved example we have. And what's interesting about it is that using pollen distribution analyses, and this is where the palynologists come into their own, as some of you I'm sure know, we can work out that this lake doesn't simply represent its immediate environment. Many of the pollens represent the whole area, several thousand square kilometers. So it's a good indicator of what's going on in a substantial microregion of Anatolia. And again, I've just tabulated some of these important points here. So if you start at the bottom, before 540, it's dry. And in terms of rural land use, we have relatively dense settlement and agriculture with cereals and tree crops. And then between 540 and 750, it's very wet. And before 680 CE, this dense settlement and agriculture continues. And then from 750 to 950, it's moderately dry, and we have this rural abandonment. And then after about 950, we have population increase and the introduction on a greater scale than before of an agro-pastoral economy. And the implications of that are quite important, and I'll come back to them if I've got a chance later. This is a historical map at the back and the background with all the Greek place names, although they're in Latin characters. And then again, you can see the area that we're talking about here. Now, I should say, before we go any further, major Arab invasion routes at this period came up this way through the Cilician gates, slap bang through the middle, and then on the way up to Constantinople, or up here and through Caesarea, Kayseri, modern Kayseri, into Central Asia Minor. The site I'll be talking about in a minute is about here. So when we look at the historical sources for this period, we find some very interesting things. From 664, which is, you remember, when our anthropogenic activity begins to decline fairly dramatically, there are almost annual Arab raids into and through this whole region. We have 1 or 2 accounts describing the impact on the local economy. Normally, when we don't have any other corroboration, we have to be very careful about the rhetoric built into these medieval texts, because of course they're all full of doom and gloom and disaster, the apocalypse is coming, and you can't always believe what they say. But in this case, we've the environmental data is really useful. Many of these raiding forces overwintered on Byzantine territory. In fact, because of the nature of Arab history writing, which used what are called isnads or chains of transmission, we know the leaders, they even know the names of some of the leaders of these expeditions, which is it's interesting. It's actually useless information, but it's interesting. And according to the texts, the population was enslaved or driven away or killed. Now, I should say there's a caveat again here, because although the palynology reflects an absolute collapse of anthropogenic activity, the archaeology shows us that the population was still there. There are fortifications and little castles, and there are small settlements, fortified and defended settlements, and one or two larger centres. But the palynology basically is reduced to a statistical minimum. So the population was there, but they weren't producing enough for it to show up in the pollen record. And we can, again, the palynologists will tell you that that's a situation that you often find, and we understand that quite well. So the fact that we have no record of human activity in this period doesn't mean that there are no people there and that they're not doing something and probably surviving perfectly adequately, but they're not producing enough for it to show up in the pollen record in any meaningful or statistically useful way. The documentary sources also provide some interesting information. They show us that there's in the East Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire at this period, there's a shift in the way in which tax was assessed and collected. We don't have a lot of evidence, but it's very clearly indicated by some of our texts. There's a shift in terminology to reflect a much greater emphasis on grain production, particularly, we assume, for the army and for the capital Constantinople. There are shifts in the way in which the East Roman government distributes and manages its resources, particularly its demographic resources for military and defensive purposes. And these are indicated also in the process of, which again we know from our written sources, the process of managing the armies, recruiting them, billeting them, where they were based and so forth. And you can see this quite interestingly when we look at the pattern of grain sources. The East Roman Empire traditionally drew its grain before the Arab Islamic invasions from Egypt. Egypt is a breadbasket of the Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. Huge shipments, hundreds and hundreds of ships full of grain left Egypt every year, travelled up through the Aegean, supplying various cities and towns on the way. But their main purpose was to get to Constantinople, the capital of the empire, the imperial capital, and fill the imperial granaries, which they did on a regular basis, and we have a lot of information about how that system worked, both from Egyptian papyri and from documents which were related to Constantinople. There's a Persian invasion in the early 7th century we can leave to one side, but with the Arab Islamic conquests, Egypt is lost for good, and so the empire needs to find a new way of providing itself with grain, and it therefore tries these different possibilities. North Africa had always been a possible supplier, but it's a long way away, and the sea routes are problematic with Arab raiders and so forth, so it's insecure. Sicily, which the empire holds on to very tenaciously all through this period, remained a major grain producer, but again, transport and sea routes very problematic in times of war. And times of war means the whole of the 8th century, or the whole of the second half of the 7th into the 8th and early 9th century. So Sicily does supply some grain, and we have evidence for that, but on an occasional basis. Southern Italy doesn't really count. Thrace, which is here, and you would think would be, it's good, if you travel to Turkey now, go to Edirne, for example, and get the train down to Istanbul. It's flat, grain-growing terrain, it's beautiful agricultural country, but the problem in the 7th and 8th century was there is a group of nomad people who are moving down into the Balkans called the Bulgars, a Turkic people, who harness the power of the indigenous Slavic population and make constant war on the beleaguered Byzantine Empire, so that Thrace is also not very secure. Then we have Bithynia, which is northwestern Asia Minor, also today good grain-growing territory, but frequently the subject of Arab and Islamic raids which are pushing towards Constantinople. They never take it. There's a lot of interesting Arabic, Islamic poetry and apocalyptic literature about how Constantinople will one day become a Muslim town, but that doesn't actually happen until 1453, of course, when the Ottoman Turks take it. But Bithynia is a challenge, but it does produce some. most interestingly, an area that really up till now has had very little, if any, role in supplying Constantinople or anywhere else except its own hinterland, is this Pontic coastal region, Paphlagonia and Pontus. Now it's an interesting region because the mountains, particularly on the eastern Pontus, come almost right down to the sea. The mountains, within 3 or 4 miles of the coast, you're in the mountains. And that area is primarily today used for production of various fruits and nuts. You have to go beyond the Pontic Alps, so 30 miles inland, through the passes, onto the Anatolian plateau to find reasonably good cereal growing terrain. But our evidence suggests that Paphlagonia, this Pontic region, now becomes an important supplier of grain. And so we were wondering whether we could find any evidence other than the occasional hints in the form of various types of documents such as lead seals of officials and occasional references in historical text and chronicles. Could we find any other evidence for this region supplying Constantinople? And just to show you why logistics and supply is important, you'll notice that I've put these are notional figures. They're based on late Roman documents, so they're probably not entirely out of order, but we don't know that these are the numbers of the various Byzantine armies based in Asia Minor. But you notice that the smallest army is based in the biggest region, and that's because the biggest region is actually the poorest area. It's the agriculturally least productive. So clearly there's a relationship which we can deduce between the wealth of a territory and the number of soldiers who are put there. Where the territory is relatively agriculturally wealthy, you put more soldiers there. Where it's poor, you put fewer soldiers there. So we know that one of the priorities of the government must have been logistical, must have been to do with resource allocation and distribution. Now then, when we start looking at particular issues, we pull all these different things together. We have restructured fiscal arrangements. We think that because we can't relate agrarian output changes to climate, that this must have been introduced by farmers changing their market and sales pitch, as it were, or landlords at least. But more importantly, we think it's probably a response to state pressure. And all the evidence for both the palynological evidence and the historical data appears to focus in the 640s or 650s to 670s and 680s for this shift in emphasis from a broader based palette or regime of crop output to a much more restricted one with many more people producing much more grain and more livestock. Bearing in mind, of course, that we also have a demographic collapse and therefore the absolute numbers of output would have gone down. But the relative proportions between them shifted in favor of grain and livestock. And so the state probably further exacerbated through its taxation policy these shifts. And the question was, could we find any archaeological data for this? Now I should say that the field project began before this project began. And one of the reasons we were asking these questions at this stage was because we had some rather anomalous evidence from our field project which we couldn't fit into what we assumed would be the general pattern. And I haven't got much time left, so I'm going to whiz through the archaeology. Sorry, archaeologists, I'm going to go through the archaeology very quickly. This is a site, X marks the spot. This is a site called, in ancient times or medieval times, Efkaita. Then in Turkish until the renaming or the renaming of villages in the 1940s and 50s in Turkey, it was called Afkat, same place. It's now called Beyözü, which is a modern Turkish name. These are our two saints, St. Theodore the Recruit and St. Theodore the General. There's an interesting history about that, but I said I wouldn't talk about hagiography, so I won't. And just to test your medieval Greek epigraphy, here's an inscription. I've resolved it there. This is an inscription which tells us that this town, Efkaita, became a bishopric and had walls built around it during the early 6th century, during the reign of the Emperor Anastasius. You all translated that? Good. So, and this is, we are looking here, we're on the main west-east road, looking north. And you can just see the village, you can see the minaret of the mosque. So this is the situation. The mountains behind it are called the Afkat Dağ, the Afkat mountain. And that's there's an aerial satellite image of it. And this, if you can make it out, this area here is the Citadel, which was basically a refugium. In other words, it wasn't occupied in a settled, regular way. It was a place where people went to when there were enemy raids. And we know from the Greek, Armenian and Arabic sources that there were a number of enemy raids or attacks on Ephrata between 640 and 750. Again, I said I'm going to go through this very quickly. We did some GPR, ground penetrating radar, and some magnetometry work on the hill. You can just about make out this fortified and defended area. There are in fact evidences for several bastions along here and quite a deep wall with a big ditch and a defended entrance here. If I resolve that quickly, you can see it more clearly there. This is all GPR results. We weren't able to excavate, so we don't know what the function of any of these structures actually are. But what was also interesting was that magnetometry showed up a completely different set of differently orientated structures. The ditches and defensive areas you can see there, but these structures are orientated differently from the ones that I've just shown you, and it's possible that they represent two phases. Until we excavate, we won't know. But all the surface ceramics that we have are from the 7th century to the 10th century. So it's nothing, a few fragments of Roman and late Roman wares, but mostly material from the tiles, roof tiles, loads of roof tiles from the 7th and 8th and 9th centuries. And again, moving on quickly, we reconstructed the line. So this is one of our team working. These are footings of part of the defensive walls, but this is an interesting reconstruction. Because the town is set against the mountain behind it, it only needs walls on two sides, and that's all we could find. What's interesting, we couldn't find much trace of the walls apart from these footings, which gave us a sort of series of dots to join up. What we did was use a US Marine Corps defensive emplacement model. See, the US Marine Corps can be very useful at times, which is designed for modern armies to set up a defensive position. And so you map this onto a GIS with all your terrain features marked in, and the model will then tell you where the best defensive positions are in terms of viewshed analysis, where you can see best from, fire, sort of killing ground analysis and that sort of thing. So we used that, and it generated this red line with a buffer zone around it. When we went to look at other points on the red line, lo and behold, we found more bits of Byzantine wall. So this proves A, that the US Marine Corps has a good model for its defensive positions, and B, it's very useful for archaeologists who want to find out where things are. I'll pass over that quickly. We found that this here is probably the Martyrs Church of St. Theodore, but because, again, we couldn't excavate, we found lots of material to do with a fairly wealthy church, various imposts, lots of capital columns, a lot of Roman aggregate. Roman aggregate, for those of you who've excavated it, will know that it's much harder than most modern aggregates. You can easily break a pickaxe on it. Very tough stuff. But what was particularly interesting about this was the pattern of ceramic distributions. Most sites in Asia Minor, from the middle of the 7th century until the 10th century, retreat, as I mentioned earlier, into their fortified enceinte. There's very little extramural activity that we can detect. There haven't been all that many local field surveys done. There have been 5 or 6, which is remarkably few, given that we have hundreds of potential sites. But that reflects both financial priorities and also Turkish government politics. But most sites don't show much extramural continuity in this period of the 7th to the 9th century. Surprisingly, we found a lot. We were really quite taken aback because this is not normal. And a lot of these sites, and you can see here, this is our late Roman image. That's our early Byzantine period up to the 7th and 8th centuries. That's our middle Byzantine into the 11th century. Look at the blue dots. This is medieval Turkish. So I'll just go back. So here and you'll see if you look at these 3 areas here, they're still there. Now, whether they're continuously occupied with no break at all, the archaeology doesn't tell us. But what it does tell us that these sites were constantly used across 300 years, when in many other case studies, we would see an abandonment of these extramural sites, and then a recovery of these extramural locations, perhaps with different functions, during the 10th century. Here we have continuity. And one of the interesting things was that, again, we couldn't excavate, but the surface ceramics showed us a lot of courseware associated with the transport of cereals. And so we think we might have here the first indication on the ground in archaeological material cultural terms of some of the things I was talking about earlier. And there's new emphasis on cereal production and grain. This isn't a certain thing. I mean, it's a hypothesis, and we could be wrong. But we were quite excited by this, and so we built it into our argument. There are lots of ways in which you can fault the hypothesis, and we haven't made the case yet, and until we can excavate, which isn't going to happen in any time soon, we won't have a stratigraphy. But all our ceramics show that the use of this site, and both in Ephrata itself, the Citadel, around it, and in these extramural locations, is pretty continuous across a period when in most other major settlement sites that we know about, particularly in the south and centre, it wasn't. And then the final point, which I should have mentioned earlier, is that there is a line about 40 degrees latitude, north of which, when it's relatively dry in the Levant, long before any major shifts in either NAO or anything else, or the monsoon, when it's usually wet, and our site is in an area just beyond this 40 degree line, and of course grain needs rain. That rhymes. Grain needs rain. Cereals need something that rhymes with cereal. So the important thing is here that we may have evidence not just for anthropogenic activity, but also some help, as it were, from a slightly more conducive environment. But it was societal pressure or state pressure that kicked the process off, rather than climate or environment. And so what I've hoped to show, I hope I've not been too disjointed, is the ways in which one, with the right sorts of data, one can try to combine, I'm not claiming we've got the answers to all our questions, but one can try to combine these different data sets, paleo-environmental, paleoclimatic on the one hand, archaeological and historical on the other, to make a more comprehensive and perhaps more plausible picture of what's going on. So the story of what's happening in the East Roman world in Anatolia in the 7th century isn't simply one of unmitigated gloom and doom and invasions. It's one of innovation, resilience, to some degree sustainable politics and strategies on the part of farmers, as well as a range of other institutional structural elements. There is a lot more to say, but I'm out of time, and if I don't stop now, we won't have any questions. So thank you all for your attention. Question at the back.
Can you describe how the populations would be different intramurally versus outside the walls, in terms of their, whether they're free or not, their education, their producing?
They'd probably be the same people. These are almost certainly sites of activity, but not sites of habitation. There may be limited seasonal habitation there, but the normal situation in Anatolia, certainly this period of relatively low density population and population retrenchment, demographic retrenchment, is that rural populations live in, or agrarian populations live for the most part within the urban centres closest to them. And some of these places that we call cities are only called cities because that's what the Romans called them. They used the word polis. But actually they're sort of pretty miserable one-horse dumps. I mean, we know that Ephrata's walls were more or less ineffective. When they were attacked, they all had to run up the hill into the Citadel, although they had a nice wall with a nice gate, but it didn't really stop the Arabs getting in. So the population groups are almost certainly the same. Are they free or unfree? They're all free peasants. There's no evidence for slavery or anything like that in that context. Domestic slavery, in other words, household slaves and servants, yes. But agrarian slavery of the sort that you get in Italy in the 1st and 2nd centuries BC and CE, no. Thanks. Yes?
I have 2 questions. The first might be a little bit outside your area, so you can skip it if so. I was wondering if there's a correction that you guys have to do for the pollen records during dry periods. Is less pollen transported in from the watershed, and how does that get accounted for in thinking about that sort of assumption or correction in accounting for the pollen climate record? And then the second question, I was wondering if you could just expand a little bit on the market structure and the details of the trade and how you get at that component with the vessels and what's actually being traded.
Sure. So on the Pollens, I'm not a palynologist, obviously. But yes, that's taken into account. And my palynologist colleagues have built that into their distribution model. In the case of the Nar pollens, because they're annually varved, we know that the pattern is reliable across a long period of time, and that the distribution seemed to represent a constant sort of a generalizable constant, if you like. So it's certainly how it's taken into account exactly the modeling I don't really understand, but it's certainly taken into account. And one of the things that palynologists or historians who've used palynology in the past have failed to take into account is precisely that sort of thing. So one of the issues that I sort of alluded to at the beginning is to bring people together in our project so that the historians don't abuse the science and the scientists don't abuse the history, because it happens so often in these broad generalizable models. Now, I don't want to accuse my colleagues who did that article on the late antique Little Ice Age of doing that, because they explicitly say we don't want to do this. But at the end of the article they say, but on the other hand, look at these parallels. So, you know, you do have to be terribly careful. Everybody wants a result. It's very hard to end an article with, well, I don't really know. Okay. So yeah, the trade and commerce. The archaeology of trade and commerce is now really, for the late Roman period up to the middle of the 7th century, is pretty well understood. There are still gaps, because we have really good ceramics and seriation of ceramics. So we know where the ceramics are made, where they come from, which sorts of markets they serviced, because the types of ceramic tell us whether they're fine wares, cooking wares, transport wares, and so forth. And we can compare across a broad swath of the East Mediterranean Levant the way in which these ceramics moved around or were exported and imported. And we know quite often from analysis of the residual contents on the inside of various types of pot what they were carrying or what they were used to cook. And sometimes you actually have sediments and things which you can actually analyze for themselves. And then we also have a lot of data in legal texts and in occasional references in, say, hagiographies, which are an important source for us, as well as histories and chronicles, and occasional accounting records of things that were traded and where they'd come from and where they went. And some of the patterns are quite surprising. So we know, for example, from a hagiographical text of the early 7th century, we know that corn was exported to Cornwall in southwest Britain, all the way round through the Bay of Biscay. And we found in southwest Britain, we found Byzantine artifacts from the 6th century. So we know that that trade existed. We haven't found anything from southwest Cornwall in Egypt. On the other hand, what was traded was copper. And we know that Cornwall and western Spain, Galicia, were major copper mining places in this period. So some of the trade is very long distance. We also find Chinese artifacts in Byzantine territory, mostly ceramics, but we know that silks were a very important trans-Eurasian import from China until the later 6th century, when the Byzantines worked out their own way of producing silk, breeding silkworms, and developed a very advanced loom, to the extent that by the middle of the 8th century, Central Asian Turkic peoples were importing Byzantine silks rather than Chinese silks. So it's a pretty globalized network. I think people often forget how globalized the pre-globalized world was. Doesn't mean to say that it's on the scale that we know now, obviously, but far more people moved around. There's a very nice, if I can just give you an anecdote, there's a very nice chance archaeological find in northern Italy in a dry riverbed of a body of what we assume is a trader with 3 mules, skeletons, all found. And the trader had attached to what remained of him a leather purse with coins from China, India, Merovingian Gaul, Anglo-Saxon Britain. This is a mid-9th century thing. Byzantium and Spain, in sort of carrying all that stuff in his pocket. So, and apparently he was swept away in a sort of flash flood, we assume. No evidence for a mugging, but does that answer your question? Sure.
Missed it. You said it a few times that the ceramic records starting in the 7th century is very poor.
It's not so good, yeah.
Why is that?
The main reason is we haven't excavated enough sites in places like Turkey to draw up a proper picture. Turkey at the moment is, I mean, we have great ceramics from Israel. We have not bad ceramics from Syria, primarily because French teams worked, even post-mandate, French teams continue to work in Syria. We have actually pretty good ceramics from Jordan, because British and German teams have been working there since the 1930s, all the way through the transition from colonial through to independence. Turkey has got increasingly xenophobic in the last 10 years, and it's got increasingly hostile to Western European, North American, British excavations. Those that deal with important sites, Hittites and classical architecture with standing remains, which can be of touristic value, are still going on quite well and well funded. But anything like Avcat, which is basically a hole in the middle of the Anatolian plateau, gets no support. So we had a real struggle to even get a permit to do a regional survey, never mind an excavation, and we were refused an excavation permit outright, on the grounds that even though actually our project team, we were working in a very poor area, we brought a lot of resource to the area. You know, our students drank more beer than had been seen in the area for 20 years. We did a lot for the local economy, and the people really liked us being there, and they were sad when we couldn't come back. But that's, you know, so it's not just that, but there's a range of other features since the 1940s and 50s in particular. And then, of course, Turkey was looted. Let's face it. I mean, a lot of Western archaeologists, you know, from Schliemann on, stole stuff. And that's caused a major issue which we still have to live with, unfortunately. So there's a combination of culturally inherited prejudices against foreign excavations, etc. There's also a question of cultural priorities. The Turkish Ataturk wrote a history book in the late 1920s, in which he wanted to demonstrate that the Hittites were actually Turkic. Now there's a teeny bit of linguistic support for that, because in one of the Proto-Anatolian languages that we can reconstruct, there are elements of an agglutinative system, which is modern Turkish and agglutinating language. And so using that as a rather slender basis, this connection with it. So the Turks are really Hittites, the Hittites are really Turks. So that's why the Hittites are so important. Of course, they are important anyway, historically. And then the Greeks themselves, we don't talk about those, but the classical civilizations that built all those nice buildings with columns and temples and stuff, they're important for tourism. Christian Byzantine society and culture, not interested. But it's not just that sort of prejudice. They're not interested in Seljuk architecture or archaeology either. Standing things like mosques built by the Seljukids or Danishmendids or other dynasties in the medieval period, yes. But Seljuk archaeology of actual important sites, you know, villages and so forth, no interest. And surprisingly, not much interest in the Ottoman world either, except in, you know, the Islamic inheritance part of it. So there are a range of issues there which all recombine to generate a pretty hostile environment. And one of the results, and then there's also financing. You know, raising money, as we all know, for archaeological projects is hard work, and keeping the continuity going for a long period is hard work. Constant fundraising has to be done. So if you combine all those things, we don't have a very good pattern of archaeological exploration in Anatolia for our period and our subject. And if you compare it with what's happened where national archaeologies are interested in their own culture, in Greece, for example, Byzantine is obviously on the menu every time. In Bulgaria, Serbia, the Balkans, anything Orthodox and to do with the Byzantine tradition is there. And it's other stuff that gets sidelined. So there are national issues, well, we all face. Anyone who's worked in any field of archaeology, even in our own countries, knows that there are issues of priorities and cultural identity to deal with. But it does make working on non-touristic but archaeologically, scientifically important sites in Turkey hard. So our picture's very lacunose.
If I can just add on to that, from my own experience working in the region, is that a lot of the early ceramic materials not collected in a way that enables broad reconstruction. So just to add on to the methodological issues of understanding ceramic sequences, having the anchoring material to really date them, and then to understand how those are changing and moving through space. When you have these early expeditions that he mentioned, They weren't really collecting those in a way that you could reconstruct where they came from or chronological sequences.
Yeah.
That wasn't how they did things.
Yeah. And just as a footnote, we can reconstruct the period up to the 650s or 640s reasonably well because we have mass-produced ceramics from all over the Mediterranean which are cross-comparable. So even when our material from Turkey isn't very good, we've got loads from elsewhere. When we find something in Turkey that looks like something from Italy, then we can start, it's not as simple as that. Once you get into this late 7th century period on, the commercial world becomes highly fragmented. It doesn't mean that things don't move a long way, but they move in a sort of hop, skip and jump manner rather than in a linear fashion. And so we don't have all the ceramics in Turkey, apart from a few, are very locally produced. We're using local clays and local materials and so forth. And therefore we don't have much to compare them with other than other places in Turkey, which increases the problem.
Well, I think we're just about out of time, but I think we're going to have lunch. If people have further questions, we'll be sitting here with our lunch.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.